Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. We welcome Stanford professor, Ambassador Michael McFaul, as part of our geopolitical series. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. For nearly 50 years, the Vail Symposium has provided our community with thoughtful, affordable programming. Some program notes before we get started. To ask a question of tonight's speaker, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. I'll share those questions with our speaker later in the program, but you can type those in there at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program runs until 7 p.m. It is being recorded. Just give us a day or so to get that up on our website, vailsymposium.org. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors, the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. The summer season is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher. Tonight's program is underwritten by Lainey and Merv Lappin and Carol and Pete Feisman. The Vail Symposium, The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. And funding has been provided to the Vail Symposium by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, Economic Stabilization Plan 2020. If you're a Vail Symposium donor, thank you. If you're not and would like to be, please visit vailsymposium.org. And I hope you'll join us next week for our program on Thursday, September 24th at 6 p.m. It's a program on the Mayan people of Mesoamerica with University of Colorado anthropology professor, Sarah Koenig. Many of us who grew up during the Cold War welcomed the thawing of relations between the United States and the former Soviet Union. The warming was not to last, and relations seem as strained as ever. Tonight, Ambassador Michael McFaul will address the history of U.S.-Russian relations post-Cold War. Ambassador Michael McFaul is the Ken Olivier and Angela Nomalini Professor of International Studies and Political Science, Director and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies, and the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, all at Stanford University. He was also the Distinguished Mingda Faculty Fellow at the Stanford Center at Peking University. He joined the Stanford faculty in 1995. He is also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. Ambassador McFaul served for 5 years in the Obama administration. First, as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council at the White House, and then as Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. He's authored several books, most recently the New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. He received his BA in International Relations and Slavic Languages and his MA in Soviet and East European Studies from Stanford University. And as a Rhodes Scholar, he completed his Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations at Oxford University. We're very honored to have him with us here tonight. Welcome, Ambassador McFaul.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks for having me. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I wish I was in Vail, Colorado and not sitting in my office where I've been since 8 in the morning. This is, I think, my 10th Zoom call of the day. And as a result, I'm going to try to I have 2 different versions of this talk. And I'm going to give the short version because I want to get to your questions. I want to be more interactive. I've been teaching at Stanford on Zoom last spring, and I've learned a few things about how to teach on Zoom. One is that you shouldn't just talk like I'm doing right now for 30 minutes. So what I'm going to try to do now is to share some slides so that you can look at something besides me. Those boot up okay? Claire, can you see those?
I am not seeing those right now, sir.
Uh-oh.
It says I'm viewing your screen, but I'm viewing Zoom right now.
That's not good because I see my slides. They're very pretty slides. Nobody else can see them? Well, there's a first for everything, isn't there, on Zoom? Let me stop share. Sorry for the delay. And now I'm going to do screen share again.
Okay, that worked.
That worked? Okay, fantastic. And now I'm not in the right place, though, on my slides. There we go. That wasn't as disastrous as the last time. A couple months ago, I was on Brian Williams' show, if you watch on MSNBC, and in the middle of live television, a wine tasting event came in through my earpiece because it was something running on my computer. So all things considered, that wasn't such a bad computer glitch. But I'm going to do the short version of this talk, and I want to get to your questions. Tonight, we're going to talk about Russia, but I do want you to know that this is the focus of my research right now is to look at both great power competition between the United States and Russia on the one hand, and the United States and China on the other. The new Cold War is a phrase that many people use to describe our relationship with Russia today. The President of the United States, of course, on Twitter, he did it. Lots of books have been put out talking about our new Cold War. And the Prime Minister, a few years ago, Prime Minister Medvedev, at the Munich Security Conference, called it the new Cold War, comparing it to our Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. For another day and another time, and maybe when my book is out and I could fly out to see you all in Vail, we can talk about it. There's a parallel debate going on with China, talking about a new Cold War with China. And so the first thing I want to do today is compare and contrast the new Cold War with the old Cold War. Then second, pivot to explain why we are in this moment. And then third, and I'm going to try to do this all in 10 or 15 minutes, talk about what we should do policy-wise moving forward. So first on the compare and contrast. And here, this is a complicated slide, and I'm only going to go through a few of these things. But what I want to say is some things are the same and some things are different. And it's important to look at both of them, not saying it's completely different from the Cold War or completely similar. I think it's a mixed bag. And let me give you just a couple of good news, bad news comparisons. So first, good news. The good news is that today, unlike the Cold War, we are not in a quantitative nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. When we were building weapons, 30, 40, 50,000 weapons on both sides, that is over. We're down to 1,550. That's good news. By the way, you can still blow up the world with 1,550 nuclear weapons, but it's better to be at that number than 40 or 50,000 like we were during the Cold War. The bad news is that I think we've entered a new qualitative arms race, including on the nuclear side, and especially some of the Russian delivery vehicles, I think are highly destabilizing. And we don't have good solutions for how to deal with that. Second, good news, bad news. The good news is that we are not in an ideological struggle between communism and capitalism all over the planet. That is just not true. Some want to have you believe that. Our president right now talks a lot about socialism. I don't see that to be true at all. That was a long-standing battle for most of the 20th century, and most certainly the Cold War, and it was a real ideological struggle. It is now over. The bad news is that there's a new ideological struggle. At least Putin believes it is, and I think he's right, and I think we need to pay more attention to it. And that ideological struggle is along a different cleavage line. It's Putinism, which I describe as conservative Orthodox nationalism, against what he would describe as decadent Western values or liberalism. And for about a decade, for the first decade that he was in power, he was fighting that ideological struggle at home within Russia. Over the last decade, he's invested a lot of resources to export that set of ideas. And he's having some successes. In Hungary, in Italy, the UK, France, there are In Hungary, it's the leader of the government, Viktor Orban, but in all those other places, there are major political forces that identify more with Putin and his ideas than they do with Western liberal values. And also here in the United States, there are people that support this nationalist orthodox ideas against democratic values. That is very new, and I'm not sure if we're better off or worse off compared to the Cold War, because this ideological battle is not happening just between states, it's happening within states, especially in the United States and Europe. And then third, good news, bad news story about instruments of competition. The good news is that the proxy wars that we fought with the Soviets for about 4 decades are basically over. I want to remind everybody that the Cold War wasn't cold. 20 million people died fighting that war, including lots of Americans all over the planet. Thankfully, we are not doing that in our current. We do have some kind of mini proxy wars in places like Syria and Libya, but compared to Vietnam or Afghanistan or Angola, South Korea, this is a much better time in terms of lives lost. We're not killing a lot of people as we did during the Cold War. The bad news is that some of the new instruments of our current era that I call hot peace in my latest book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, are pretty scary and are pretty new, or they've been resurrected from the past. Annexation. Annexation, we thought, ended after World War II. Was in large measure the reason we fought World War II was to end annexation. For most of the Cold War, there was no annexation. Now it's back. Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 in Ukraine. That's something very scary and potentially destabilizing moving forward, not only in Europe, but maybe perhaps in Asia as well. Second, sanctions. Today, there are more Russians on the U.S. sanctions list that in any time, if you added up all the years of the Cold War and put every person that was on the sanctions list then, today, we have more people today than in the entire Cold War history. That's new, that's different. And by the way, the Russians have more Americans on their sanctions list than at any time during the Cold War. I know I'm one of them. I cannot travel to Russia today because I'm on their sanctions list. And then third, and maybe fourth, but third especially, electoral interference. During most of the Cold War, yes, there was some propagandistic things that Pravda said and Radio Moscow said, but nothing like what we experienced in 2016, a violation of our sovereignty during our presidential election then by Russia, and it's happening again today. That's new. We didn't experience that during the Cold War. And then finally, assassinations, because most recently this has happened against Alexei Navalny, who, just so you know, is a Stanford father. His daughter goes to school here at Stanford. There were some assassinations in the Cold War, but I think the pace, the number of assassinations, including in other countries, including even in NATO allied countries, the United Kingdom and Germany in particular, that's something new that we really didn't experience during the Cold War. So are we better off or worse off? We could spend the rest of the evening debating that. I think we would all agree this is not, as Claire said earlier, this is not where we thought we were going to be at the end of the Cold War, in those glorious moments when we thought we were going to have a close relationship with the Soviet Union and then Russia. Then I want to pivot to that question. First, I want to remind you that this was just 30 years ago, right? That's Ronald Reagan on the right, Mikhail Gorbachev on the left. And that's in May of 1998. Another glorious moment was when we had hundreds of thousands of Russians on Manege Square protesting basically to have democracy and capitalism and join the West. And then after they were successful, the Soviet Union collapsed and independent Russia emerged. And this is Boris Yeltsin speaking to a joint session of Congress as a hero of the democratic world. And so the second question I want to answer is what happened? How did we go from the photo on the left to the photo on the right? And by the way, the photo on the right, I was at that meeting. That's in Los Cabos, Mexico. between Mr. Putin, President Putin on the right, and President Obama on the left. And let me tell you, the meeting was a lot worse than that photo. And here, I don't want to spend too much time. The book really goes into in-depth what happened over the course of the last 30 years. But there are three big explanations that you find in academia and that you find in policy circles. One has to do with just the nature of international politics and the fact Russia is more powerful today, and they're back. And so this is just the way it always is. And I think that's part of the explanation. Russia has capabilities, but I don't think it's the whole explanation, because other countries that have recovered from revolutions or war have not risen up to challenge us. Think about Germany and Japan, where I'm not worried about wars with Germany and Japan. I am worried about confrontation with Russia. So I think you have to add something to that explanation. Second major explanation that's out there, popular especially in Moscow, is that this was all our fault. We pushed the Russians, we pushed them, we expanded NATO, we bombed Serbia, we invaded Iraq, we supported color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, and finally Russia had to push back. And I want to be clear, and I go into this in detail in the book, all of those events I just described happened. Russia did a lot of things to exacerbate tensions during that period as well. But after all of that happened, we had a period of cooperation after all of that drama. We called it the reset. It was the first 4 years of the Obama administration and President Medvedev's administration, when we were cooperating with the Russians on many big things, like the New START Treaty, sanctions on Iran, supplying our troops in Afghanistan. And so I don't think you can go back in the past to look for these times of tension to explain our current moment of confrontation, when in between you had a very extensive period of cooperation. And therefore, I fall back on Russian domestic politics as actually, I think, the real driver of our current moment of tension. And here, I would focus on Putin, his ideas about the world, and the political institutions that enable him to express those ideas around the world, the autocracy that you have in Russia today. And let me just say a couple of words about this history, and then end with a couple of ideas about prescriptions. I think this is a long, complicated history, but I think there were two moments in history in the last several years that came together that pushed us into the moment we're in now. One was the transition of Medvedev to Putin. When Putin decided in September of 2011 that he wanted to return to the presidency and ran for a third term, which he won in the spring, March 4th, 2012. It turns out that Putin and Medvedev have different views of the world. If Medvedev was our partner in the reset and thought about win-win outcomes in cooperating with the United States, Putin sees the world in zero-sum terms, where if it's +2 for the United States, it's -2 for Russia. And then second event happened, were these massive demonstrations in 2011 and 2012, after there was a falsified vote in Russia, a parliamentary vote in December 2011. You had this spark from people mostly in the big cities in Russia that says, you know, hey, we want representation. No more taxation without representation. Remember that phrase? That was one of the phrases these folks were using on the streets. And when Putin saw those demonstrations, he needed to blame somebody, because it surely couldn't just be the Russians doing that. And that's when we came into the equation. He blamed the United States, he blamed Obama, and when I arrived on the scene as ambassador in January 2012, he blamed me personally as somebody who was sent from Washington, sent by Barack Obama to foment revolution against him and his regime. And then 2 years later, there was another massive demonstration, this time in Ukraine. And again, we had nothing to do with it. The United States didn't, but Putin blamed us for this. And when the government there fell, President Yanukovych fled to Russia. That's when he, again, blamed us and decided he's no longer interested in cooperation with the West, and pivoted hard, first when he annexed Crimea, and then later when he went and did many more, what I would say, qualitatively more belligerent actions abroad. Invading Syria to prop up the worst dictator of our times, Mr. Assad, violating our sovereignty during the 2016 elections, and in 2018, sending his agents into the United Kingdom, a NATO ally, to try to poison a former Russian intelligence officer, Sergei Skripal, with an agent called Novichok, the exact agent that was used to try to kill Mr. Navalny just a few weeks ago. So what do? I have a good news, bad story to end on, and then an idea for what US policy should be. The good news, if you accept my explanation, is that we are not destined forever to be in conflict with Russia because of culture or history or the balance of power between the United States and Russia. I think this current conflict was driven by Putin and his ideas about the world. And that's a big debate in academia and in policy circles, just so you understand, about individuals versus structures, right? Agency versus these innate forces of history. I lean heavily that individuals matter. And I think this has been largely driven by the peculiar circumstances that allowed Putin to become president. That's the good news. We're not going to stuck forever. The bad news is that things are unlikely to change while Putin is in power. And he just changed the Russian constitution to allow him to be president for life, basically. And we know that President Putin works out 2 to 3 hours a day. He's in great health, and therefore I think he's going to be with us for a long time. And therefore, tragically, I think I've talked too long, I'll skip this slide. Tragically, I think we have to go back to a policy from the Cold War that was a lot about containment. In fact, I think it should be mostly about containment and to make sure that Putin's belligerency is checked where we can. And then with a healthy dose of engagement to interact with the Kremlin on issues that we think are important for the United States and our security. At the top of my list would be renewing the New START Treaty and extending it for 5 more years. And we should do that irrespective of our differences that we have with Putin about other matters. And then here, I think we need a dose of indifference. I think we've just been along, trying to get along with them. Bush did it, Obama did it. Trump has chased them all over the place for 4 years, trying to be his friend, and it hasn't worked out. It hasn't led to any concrete outcomes that I think are good for the American people. And so I think for either a second term of President Trump or a new Biden administration, we need to spend a little less time trying to be Putin's friend. And on that, I think I'll skip this slide, I'll come back to it if you want, and take your questions. But of course, if you want to learn more, you know what you have to do. You have to buy the book. All right, thanks for having me. And let me take my slides down, and now we can have some questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to actually start with a question from Merv Lappin because it goes with what you were just talking about right now. He said, historically, Russia was ruled by a czar, and so now you have Putin. And he also brings in China. You had emperors for thousands of years, and now you have Xi Jinping, who's also changed Chinese law to keep him in power for as long as he wants. Merv is an optimist. He's asking, are there any signs of democracy creeping into either of these countries? And what would need to happen to cause this? It sounds like in the case of Russia, it might be Putin leaving the Kremlin feet first.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I don't have a great answer for 2 reasons. One, I'm a political scientist, and political scientists are horrible at predicting revolutions and political change. But I also worked for 5 years in the U.S. government, and let me tell you, the CIA is really bad at it too. We didn't get the Green Revolution in Iran right. We didn't get the Arab Spring right in 2011. We didn't get Russians mobilizing on the streets of Moscow in 2011, 2012. We didn't get it right in Ukraine. and I'm not in the government anymore, so I don't know what the classified, what the government were saying, but my guess is they probably didn't get the massive demonstrations going on in Belarus right either. So I want to try to answer the question with some modesty. And I would say two things. One is, I mean, this is the fundamental argument that we have about political change in the academy, which is there are these forces, these cultural and historical forces of continuity. And if you look at Russia's 1,000 years of history, and you add in a data set, once every year, is Russia an autocracy or democracy? 99% of those thousands of years, they've been an autocracy, right? The aberrations have been when Russia was a democracy. So those historical forces are strong, and they're even stronger in China, I would say, because they have not had as much experience and experimentation with democracy as Russia had. But I'd say two more things, more optimistically. One, we know that if you look over hundreds of years, not just decades, that the more well-to-do societies are, the richer they are, the more educated they are, the more urban they are, the more likely they are to become democracies. That's modernization theory. And those trends are pretty robust. If you look at the richest countries' GDP per capita in the world today, and you take out the oil exporters, 19 of the 20 of them are democracies. The only outlier is Singapore. And that suggests that there is a relationship between getting rich, getting educated, and demanding democracy. Russia is one of the richest countries in the world that is not a democracy today. And that suggests that that pressure for democratic change in society is there. Number two, if you look over the last 30 years in Russia, there's actually been a lot of variation in terms of leadership and regime type. So Gorbachev was more democratically leaning than autocratic leaning. I'm a great admirer of what Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev did inside his country and for the world. Boris Yeltsin, he was more democratically oriented than not. And even Medvedev, I would argue, who was only president for 4 years under highly constrained circumstances, was more democratically oriented. So even in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been some variation. And then the last thing I would say is this: never believe that Putin is Russia. In the same way that when Americans would get offended if you were sitting in Russia and somebody said, well, Trump is America, you would say, that's not true. There's some people that support him, some people that don't. There are people that live in the countryside. There are people that live in urban places. We are a multi-ethnic society. Russia is all those things as well. And one of my criticisms of our media, of which I'm a part of, is that we don't bring enough of that nuance and complexity in the debates when we talk about Russia. And I would just say, take my word for it, Russia and Russians is much more complex place. And I'm skeptical that Putin has the kind of support that opinion polls might lead you to believe. Remember, a couple of things when you read those opinion polls. Number one, Putin controls all the media. He controls parliament. He controls all the oligarchs. So nobody's out there criticizing him. The one person who has tried was just poisoned recently, Mr. Alexei Navalny, right? So that he controls the entire media space. It's hard to be competitive with him in an opinion poll when you don't have any way to express that. Number two, Russia is a highly surveilled state. So those that are answering questions in opinion polls are doing so knowing that their phones are likely to be listened to. So if you're sitting out there in Vladivostok and Misha calls you from Moscow to say, hey, I'm doing an opinion poll. What do you think of Putin? I think there's only one rational answer, which is, I love Putin. Why else would you answer anything else? And And, you know, the last thing I would say with respect to that is, despite all of that, there still are incredibly brave people demonstrating against the regime. Out in Khabarovsk, you've had demonstrations there for the last couple months. And even against all of those odds that I just described, you've had some opposition figures just win local elections literally just last Sunday. So I don't think there's as much support for Putin as you might think. Having said all that, Claire, I don't think there will be political change while Putin is in power. But I think there's likely to be a very volatile period once he's out of power.
Several people have been asking about how the economy factors into this. Ed has asked about this, as has George. And in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, Alina Polyakova writes that the combination of the drop in oil prices, the pandemic, and economic stagnation have all eroded public support for Putin. Now, as you've just said, we'd never know this from the polling. So is Polyakova correct?
Well, she's very talented. I know her well. You should read everything she writes, just so you know. I haven't seen the piece, but I think she is, those trend lines definitely are true. You know, what happened was, again, to take 20 years of history and boil it down into 90 seconds, you know, Putin was an accidental president. The Russian people didn't have some clamoring for him. He was picked by Boris Yeltsin out of the blue to be the next president. The Russian people then ratified it. And right as he became president, that's when the Russian economy started to grow, mostly driven by oil and gas prices. But that's what led to his popularity initially, right? After a decade of depression, the economy started to grow, and that's led to his reelection. And he was genuinely popular back for those first 2 terms. I think that is true. Then Medvedev came in for a while, and there were people that liked Medvedev, by the way, and thought it was good to have a more modernizing, pro-Western president. And they were the ones that lamented Putin coming back. And he was kind of stuck. His opinion poll ratings were stuck at like 60%. He was pretty frustrated by that period. And then there was a boost in his ratings that had to do with the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. That was framed as a war against Nazis and NATO and a return for what was rightfully Russia's, according to the propaganda, which is to say Crimea. And that's when his ratings went way back up again, 70 or 80%. That was a very popular event, but that was 6 years ago, right? So that has worn off at the same time that sanctions have kicked in, at the same time now that you have the pandemic. And I think Elena's points are correct, that his popularity has waned as a result of those forces. And I don't think it'll be easy for him to go back to that old playbook. I don't think it'll work to invade Moldova again and blame it on the United States. And I think he's kind of stuck right now.
Well, to that point, George and Stephen are both asking about Belarus and how this will affect Russia and whether or not Putin will interfere in some way in the situation in Belarus where the current president is not popular and there's large protest against him.
Well, first, I want to say that Belarus, what's happening there is just incredibly inspirational to me as somebody who studies democratic movements, and the bravery that those people have had against lots of police brutality and arrests just shows the power of the people, right? When it's 50 people on the square, the police can arrest them. When it's 100,000, it's a lot harder. And I am deeply moved and inspired by what the people are doing there. And I would remind you all, if you're not following it closely, that it's the women that are really leading this struggle. I was just on a call with people from Belarus yesterday, 2 days ago, or, it all blurs together, but recently, listening to them and talking to them, very inspirational what they're doing. I don't know how it's going to end, but I think it underscores when you hear these deterministic arguments that nothing can ever change in these societies. These brave Belarusians are proving that wrong. And I think they've jumped over some threshold. Maybe Lukashenko can wait it out, and he's kind of waiting for winter, and the mobilization will decrease. But they'll never go back to accepting him as a legitimate leader. I don't know when that regime is going to end, but it's never going to recover. It's never going to get back on its feet. It's in its dying days. Whether those are dying days and years, I don't know, but it's not going to recover. With respect to Putin, I would say two things. On the one hand, he really doesn't like Lukashenko. We've known that for a long time. They've had a lot of tension in their relationship. And at the same time, he does not want to see a so-called Maidan revolution or color revolution be successful in Belarus, because that undermines a lot of his own propaganda at home about how Russians need a strong state and culturally they like the czar. These are the kind of themes that he's been developing for years and now decades, while Belarusians ethnically, historically, culturally are very similar to Russia. So if they can have a democratic breakthrough there, that's highly threatening to Putin. And I went through my slides rather quickly because I wanted to get to your questions, but Putin's paranoia about mass mobilization against him is real. He is deeply frightened by that. And that's why this is such a precarious moment for him. I think so far the strategy is to wait out the demonstrators and to just hold on to the stalemate and to hope that winter will eventually kick in. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. That's all I would say. I don't know what's going to happen there. I guess I think it's going to be very difficult for Putin to invade militarily. I think that would be a very costly moment. And of course, this moment is happening at a time when you have finally, in my view, well, not finally, that's not fair, but you have increased the debate inside Germany about the nature of their relationship with Russia because of the poisoning of Mr. Navalny. And so for Russia to take military action in Belarus, I think would only exacerbate tensions between Russia and Germany and Russia and the EU that are already at a very strained position.
I think that brings us to a great point with Andrew Coiner's question. And he's asking about things like annexation and wars of conquest. And he asked, what's the best way of preventing this in the future? This is a field that Andrew's been doing research in. And he said his research, he's found that cooperation between international organizations and strong democracies is the best and most effective method for trying to contain this behavior.
Well, I would agree with that. I think that's right. And we're always better off together than apart. And I think, democratic countries of the world need to be more united. Our current president doesn't really believe in these issues. He doesn't talk much about democracy and human rights. He doesn't meet with opposition figures like President Obama and President Bush used to do. And I think that's a mistake. I think that when we're divided, we're going to be worse off. And there will be times in the future where we'll need our allies, not just when they'll need us, as we learned after September 11th. So I hope that that policy trajectory will be reconsidered. Number two, I would say peace through strength, a phrase that Ronald Reagan used to use. And I think that is right. And so I think the strengthening of NATO that happened after the Russian intervention in Ukraine was a good set of policies, and that reduces the probability that there will be an attack on NATO country. I'm still quite worried that that could happen. I'm actually really worried about it, and I don't think it's getting enough attention in the United States, but that would be another thing to deter these kinds of activities from happening, especially in the countries that are allied with us within NATO. And then number three, it's not appropriate right now with Putin, but it is the case that tensions in the countries around Russia have usually decreased when there's been a better relationship between Moscow and Washington. And the tensions increase between the two capitals usually make the states, the smaller states around Russia, more insecure. But that is not in the cards with Vladimir Putin right now, because he's not interested in that kind of relationship with us right now.
Both Ed and Pete would like us to circle back to the economy, in particular, the importance of oil and gas sales to the Russian economy. And given the slump in oil and gas prices, what else does Russia have to build in its economy and to create jobs?
Well, Russia is still highly dependent on oil and gas, despite attempts to move it away. President Medvedev, when he was there from 2000 to 2008, had a very big push to diversify the economy. He understood, I used to interact with him fairly often, that the future of the 21st century is about education and brains and technology, not about things that you take out of the ground. But Putin's pivoted away from that, and as I think they're kind of stuck right now. And there's greater state intervention in the economy today than there was 10 years ago, and I don't think that's going to change under Vladimir Putin. Now, having said that, there are larger pieces of the economy that I think go unnoticed. It is a big consumer society now, and that has changed over time. And some American companies do rather well there as a result of that. But they're still very dependent on oil and gas. The problem, however, one should not jump from that conclusion to think, therefore, that this regime is going to collapse. I just want to remind you that really bad regimes with no money can last for a long, long time. I did my PhD dissertation about Southern Africa. And wrote about Angola after independence. And Angola back then, and still today, but especially back then, was an incredibly corrupt society, dictatorship, completely dependent on oil, very poor country, had negative growth for many, many years. And yet that regime has held on since 1976, folks. And so, we in America, we tend to think, well, if people are dissatisfied with the economy, that's going to lead to political change. But how? Like, what do you do when you can go to jail or be killed because these regimes have that coercive power? And so that causal relationship between economic decline and political change is a lot more inexact than I most certainly would like it to be.
Pivoting to foreign policy, Chris Matlin is asking about Russian objectives in the Middle East. And we've also had questions specifically about Russia and their intentions with Iran.
So those are good questions. So a couple of things. I mean, first, with respect to Iran, Putin has cultivated a partnership there for many decades now, and they mostly ally with each other. The illiberal international, I call it, right? China, Russia, and Iran. They're usually together. I want to just say historically, it was a pretty big breakthrough. We managed in the Medvedev years to pull that relationship apart. And in 2010, put in place the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions against Iran in the history of the UN's relationship with Iran. And we did that in partnership with Russia. And I just underscore that just to remind you that there's more variation in these relations, right? It's not just this continuity. And if you want to read more, I have a whole chapter on it in my book, by the way, about how we managed to do that, how we managed to pull Russia away from Iran for that 4-year period. And the Iranians were very upset with Medvedev as a result of that. But when Putin came back, he pivoted back to this relationship. And today, of course, Russia, I think, is well, without question, is Iran's closest military partner in the region, and has allied with Iran and Hezbollah to support the Assad regime, and they're in a military alliance to support that regime. Tragically, and I think we've handled that very poorly, the United States. In addition, I would say that especially in the last 5 or 6 years, Putin has, he has an aggressive strategy to reinstate Russia as a great power in the Middle East. After the Soviet Union collapsed, that kind of went away, but he's done it. And I think we have to say that he's done it rather successfully. What he did in Syria by intervening, he's propped up that dictator, and, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people died, but he's now in control there and we're not. He's now active in Libya in a way that we are not. And then in parallel to those civil wars, he has over the years crafted a very delicate diplomatic strategy of re-engaging with the Arab autocracies and monarchies in the region and Israel. He has Russia-Israeli relations today are closer than they've ever been. Russia-Saudi relations today are closer than they've ever been. And that's incredible if you think about that. Russia also has managed to preserve its relationship with Iran. And I would say he's also cultivated a new relationship with Mr. Erdogan. And so Russia is playing a much more active role at a time when, the United States has withdrawn from the region.
Going back to Putin again, I have heard it speculated that he may well be the wealthiest person in the world. And Stephen Dowdle also has a question about, do we know the extent of Putin's wealth, and wouldn't it be helpful to have that kind of information?
Yeah, your question's reminding me when we were rolling in to meet with Putin, both as prime minister and president. When I worked at the White House, my job was to brief the president before those meetings. And actually, when I was ambassador, I did that several times as well. The two numbers that would drive Obama nuts were Putin's popularity ratings and the numbers about his wealth, because they were always bigger than Obama's. And Obama's a very competitive guy, by the way. And on the approval ratings, that number would always drive him nuts because, it would be 75 or whatever. And he would say, well, if I controlled Fox News and ABC, NBC, CBS, and every billionaire in America was subservient to me, and everybody in the Senate and the House of Representatives were in my party, I'd be at 90%. How hard is that? And then that second number would drive him nuts too. I would just say two things. One, some of the things I know I can't talk about that are classified, but he's a very wealthy gentleman. And to the point about policy, I strongly believe that the United States should declassify that information to a much greater degree than we do. And we also, as a country, should stop allowing Russians and Chinese and all kinds of other people to launder their money through companies and real estate here in Palo Alto or in Delaware. I just think that if you want to fight corruption and help the Democrats, that is a very practical reform that is long overdue. There's just no reason, there is no moral reason why we need to have companies that we don't know who owns them. I believe that very strongly. And it reminds me of a comment that one of my friends used to make. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 2015. His name was Boris Nemtsov. But Boris was a human rights activist in Russia, a fantastic, charismatic leader. And when he met with Obama, I heard him say it many times, but I remember it very vividly because I was just looking at a photo of him. In fact, I may even try to post it just for fun while we're talking. He said to me, But then he said to Obama when they met in July 2009, he said, "I don't want your help, President Obama. We don't need your help, but we don't want you to help our enemies." That was a strong message. He said, "Stop helping the autocrats of the world." And we help the autocrats of the world by allowing them to, park their money here in the United States. That as a practical matter, that's a policy thing I think we should do. But there's a third thing I want to say, which is to also remind people that it's not just what money Putin has in the bank. It's that Putin, in a way, owns everything in Russia. Which is to say, the giant mansions and castles that he's built, some of which I've been to when I was the U.S. ambassador, he built that with taxpayer money, but he enjoys that, right? He gets to use that. That's called property rights, right? He gets to go to all those places and use those. The yachts that the oligarchs own, he doesn't own them, but he can access and use any yacht owned by any Russian at any time that he wants. That's what comes with the structure of the regime that it's created today. So always remember that he basically owns everything. It's not just the money parked in bank accounts, but it's the nature of the regime that allows him those kinds of property rights as well.
You mentioned earlier that Putin effectively controls the media in Russia. And James Wolcott has asked about how the Russian people reacted when Navalny was poisoned and then had to be sent off to Germany in a coma. And yeah, I'm just, was it even covered? Was there any way to gauge the reaction of the Russian people to that event?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. James asked, right? And this is a question that a lot of social scientists are trying to study more in depth. So let me pump the brakes a little bit. Putin doesn't control all the media. That's a good thing. He controls all the major television stations. That's the first thing he went after. Two of the three television stations were independent or quasi-independent when he came in 2000, and he took those over right away. When I was the U.S. ambassador, there was a television station called Doge TV that was still, you could still get it in your cable package. It was not broadcast, but you could still get it in your cable package. Very popular, tremendous reporting. He's now pushed them out of broadcast and cable TV, but they're still on the internet. And there's still little pockets of independent media. So there's Echo Moskvy, a radio station that still exists that has some independence. I was just on a program with them a couple weeks ago. And then the internet is still controlled, but more or less free. And that's where Alexei Navalny operates, right? And his operation, the reason Navalny is so popular, to go back to an earlier question, is he exposes corruption. That's the main thing he does. That's the main thing his NGO does. And then he uses Instagram and YouTube and Twitter and VKontakte to spread the information about this corruption. And that's what's made him extremely popular. That's why he's so dangerous to the regime. And to the specific question, I don't have my phone with me. I can look right now because I follow Alexei Navalny on Instagram. The Russian government wants you to believe that nobody supports him and his support is at less than 0.2%. And if you listen to the propagandists, that's what they'll say. And yet when he posted his photo, let's see if I can find it. No, I don't want to take time. I don't want to waste our time. When he posted a photo of him in his bed in the hospital with his 2 children and wife around him, I think 2 million people liked that photo, right? And Russia's a country of 150 million people, which is to say that we don't have a good sense of his popularity or the way that younger people are getting their news. The survey, the work that I've seen that I trust, not unlike our own country, shows that, you know, the younger you are, the less likely you are to get your news from broadcast television, and the more likely you are to get it from Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and these other platforms. And that suggests that that could be part of the reason why Mr. Putin is falling in popularity. Because I do think, just, you know, I'm not sure I could prove this, but the younger you are, I think the opinion polls are pretty clear on this. The younger you are, the less likely you are to support Mr. Putin. And conversely, the younger people are the ones that have been turning out in these demonstrations against the regime.
Turning our attention to Ukraine, we have a question from Lauren Hershey. And he's curious as to what's going to happen with Ukraine. Will they wind up being dominated by Russia? Will they end up moving closer to the EU and NATO? Is there a realistic way for that to happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I was in air on Instagram. He only got 1.5 million likes. But his account is followed by 1.9 million people. And his YouTube page is also extremely popular. So again, that's a very large following of people, and the majority of them are inside Russia. To Ukraine, I'm really worried about Ukraine. In my slideshow, you saw that my prescriptions for how to deal with Russia is to strengthen NATO, keep the sanctions in place until Russia changes its behavior, and to support democratic consolidation in Ukraine. And nobody's paying attention in the West, but that's not happening. Mr. Zelensky, the new president there, is not consolidating democracy. The oligarchs are back in power. There's all kinds of weird machinations with various Russian elements there. And I fear they keep having breakthroughs, right? The Orange Revolution, well, first independence in 1991, then the Orange Revolution in 2004, then the Maidan Revolution in 2014. And yet, after the revolution, it kind of tapers off, and here we are, and that's happening again. And I just would hope, I wish the United States and the Trump administration would understand that the best way to contain Putin is for democracy in Ukraine to succeed. And we've taken our eye off the ball there. And I worry that over time, Russia might reassert its, you know, informal hegemonic control over Ukraine.
We're just about out of time, but there's a question from Carol Floyd. It came in early and I've been holding off, but I definitely want you to answer this question. Do you know why you were put on the sanctions list?
The Russia sanctions list. Yes, I do. And it's a good place to end on a more personal note. In fact, I don't have much light on here. Let me put on this light. So there's a small personal reason and then a bigger reason. So remember, in 2014, the Obama administration decided to put sanctions on Russian individuals. That was right when I left the government, by the way. I left right as Putin invaded Ukraine. I came back here to Palo Alto. And once we had sanctioned, several of their government officials, Russia, we expected it in a tit-for-tat way, sanctioned several of us in the government. By that time, I was already not a government official, but when I met with the ambassador, Mr. Kislyak, who maybe you heard about, given his all the various meetings he had with the Trump transition team. I actually knew Mr. Kislyak, Ambassador Kislyak, well when I worked at the White House. I did a lot of work with him. And he came out, he was in the California one day, and he came by to brief me about my status. And he said, Mike, it's nothing personal. We just needed to go after some high profile people that we knew were close to Barack Obama. And on Russia, you're the guy that was closest to Barack Obama, and, no hard feelings. So that's how I ended up on the list. But, you know, I think it's a longer reason, but also an inspired reason, which is to say that, and by the way, I'm the only former ambassador to Moscow, except one other person to be on this persona non grata list. But the only other guy is a guy named George Kennan. So that's pretty good company to be on a list with George Kennan. I wear that with a badge of honor. But there's another reason that I'm on the list, because I told you earlier that Putin, you know, he fears the color revolutions. He believes guys like me are fomenting revolution against Russia, and that is not the case. I was not doing that, even though I had lots of friends in the democratic movement before the time that I was ambassador. But that's part of it, right? That I'm the color revolution guy, and so ban me for that. By the way, just so you know, Google McFaul and color revolution, and now tragically and in some strange way, supporters of President Trump are now accusing me of having written a masterminded plan for how to foment a color revolution against President Trump. That's how crazy our times are in our country, but that's a debate for another time. So that's another reason that I got on the list. But there's one more reason, and I want to end on this. One of my Russian friends, when I was, you know, having some difficulties, there was all this disinformation run against me, and it was unpleasant. I don't want to trivialize it. You know, when a video runs in Moscow, this happened in 2012, suggesting that you're a pedophile, that happened to me, that's unpleasant. And the Russian government really went after me with disinformation. Now we've all heard about disinformation, but this was 8 years ago when this was a new technique. And it was pretty disconcerting, and there were death threats and all these kinds of things. And one day I was meeting with a Russian friend of mine who knew Putin, but also knew me from decades. And, you know, I just asked this person, you know, why are they so hostile against me? You know, after all, I love Russia. You know, I've lived 6 or 7 years of my life in Russia. I have no animosity towards Russians. We just have our disagreements with the regime. And my friend turned to me and he said, Mike, that's exactly why they're going after you. Because you do love Russia and Russians. It would be easier if you were just some cold warrior. It's the fact that you do have this love for Russia and respect for Russian culture and history that makes you so dangerous to this regime. And that's always resonated with me as an explanation. And I want to be clear, I haven't been to Russia for 6 years. That's the longest I've been out of that country since 1983. I look forward to going back someday, but at least that answer gave me a clear answer for why I'm on the sanctions list today.
Ambassador McFaul, thank you so much for carving some time out of your very busy schedule for the Vail community. This has been a fascinating talk. My apologies to all the people who asked questions. There were a ton of questions tonight. We tried to get through as many as we could, but I know there's some folks we didn't get to their questions, and I apologize. Everyone out there, I hope you'll join us next week on Thursday, September 24th, when we welcome Professor Kernick from CU Boulder to discuss the Maya people of Mesoamerica. Again, thank you all, and thank you, Ambassador.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Ask your questions on Twitter. I'll try to get to them there, okay? All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much.
Thanks for having me.